Bullies pulled the new girl's hair. She snapped his arm in one twist. Delaney Reese pressed her back against the cold, unforgiving metal of her locker, the sharp edges digging into her shoulder blades through her worn cotton sweater. The sensation was becoming familiar, this desperate attempt to blend into the background noise of Riverside High School's bustling hallway, to become invisible among the sea of students who moved with the easy confidence that came from belonging somewhere. 3 weeks into the semester, and she still felt like a ghost, haunting corridors filled with teenagers who had known each other since they were 5 years old, sharing juice boxes and playground secrets that had evolved into teenage dramas and social hierarchies she couldn't begin to navigate. Her petite frame, barely scraping 5 feet tall even in her worn sneakers, made her easy to overlook in a crowd, something she'd grown grimly accustomed to after moving from town to town with her military father for the past 16 years of her life. This time, after what felt like an endless succession of temporary homes and brief friendships, they landed in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where endless cornfields stretched like golden oceans beyond the school's weathered brick walls. And the biggest excitement most people had experienced was the annual Harvest Festival. The morning light filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the polished linoleum floors, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Students flowed around her in predictable patterns, the athletes with their letter jackets and confident swagger, the theater kids gesticulating wildly as they discussed their latest production, the academic elite clutching thick textbooks and wearing expressions of perpetual stress. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged, except for her. Her auburn hair hung in loose, natural waves past her shoulders, often covering half her face like a protective curtain she could hide behind when the weight of curious stares became too much to bear. The color was striking, a rich, coppery red that caught the light and drew attention she desperately didn't want. Wire-rimmed glasses perched delicately on her nose, constantly sliding down and requiring adjustment, a nervous habit that had become second nature. Her clothes spoke of someone trying desperately not to draw attention, simple dark jeans that had seen better days, oversized sweaters in muted colors that hung loose enough to disguise her figure, and beat-up sneakers that made no sound as she walked. What none of her classmates knew, what none of them could possibly guess from looking at her unassuming exterior, was that beneath those carefully chosen baggy sleeves lay muscles honed by years of rigorous, disciplined training. Her father, Sergeant Major Daniel Reese, a Marine Corps instructor with 25 years of service and the scars to prove it, had insisted she learn to defend herself from the time she could walk steadily. It hadn't been a suggestion or a casual recommendation. It had been a requirement as non-negotiable as breathing. "The world isn't safe for little girls who can't protect themselves," he'd told her when she was 7 years old, standing in their temporary living room in yet another base housing unit. "I won't always be there to shield you from the ugly things, Del. You need to be your own shield." Krav Maga, with its brutal efficiency and focus on real-world combat situations, had become second nature to her by the time she was 10. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu followed, teaching her leverage and technique that could overcome size and strength disadvantages. Muay Thai rounded out her education in violence, its emphasis on striking and clinch work filling gaps in her defensive arsenal. What had started as her father's paranoid insistence had evolved into something she genuinely loved: the discipline, the mental clarity, the confidence that came from knowing she could handle herself in any situation. But she'd learned long ago, through painful experience in half a dozen different schools, that revealing such skills only led to more problems. People either wanted to test her, to see if the quiet girl could really do what the rumors claimed, or they became afraid of her, treating her like a loaded weapon they didn't understand. Neither reaction had ever led to the normal teenage experience she desperately craved. "Watch where you're going, freak," Colton Bradley's voice cut through her melancholy thoughts like a blade, his shoulder deliberately clipping hers, with enough force to send her carefully organized books tumbling to the floor in a cascade of papers and pens. The collision wasn't accidental. She could tell by the way he'd adjusted his trajectory at the last second, the slight smirk that played at the corners of his mouth as he watched her struggle to maintain her balance. The quarterback towered over her at 6'2", his blonde hair perfectly styled with what was probably expensive product, every strand seemingly placed with deliberate precision. His Letterman jacket was pristine, the leather sleeves supple and well-maintained, the patches and pins arranged with military precision. Everything about his appearance screamed privilege and entitlement, from his designer jeans to his spotless athletic shoes that probably cost more than Delaney's entire wardrobe. Behind him stood his faithful shadows, his ever-present entourage that seemed to exist solely to amplify his cruelty. Jackson Mills, stocky and mean-spirited, with the build of a linebacker and the intellectual capacity of a particularly aggressive brick. His dark hair was buzzed short, military style, and his small eyes held a gleam of malicious intelligence that suggested he enjoyed causing pain for its own sake. Beside him, Braden Cross completed the trinity of torment, his cruel smirk never seeming to leave his angular face. He was the prettiest of the three, with carefully tousled brown hair and the kind of cheekbones that would have made him perfect for modeling, if not for the cold emptiness in his green eyes. Delaney knelt to gather her scattered papers, her cheeks burning with the familiar shame that had become her constant companion over the past week. Her chemistry notes were now mixed with her history homework, and her copy of To Kill a Mockingbird had landed face down with its pages splayed open like a broken bird. "Sorry," she mumbled, though every fiber of her being knew she'd done nothing wrong, that this was yet another calculated humiliation designed to remind her of her place in the school's carefully maintained social hierarchy. "Yeah, you should be," Jackson sneered, deliberately lifting his foot and stepping down hard on her chemistry notes, grinding the heel of his shoe into the paper until the equations she'd carefully copied were nothing but illegible smears. "Maybe next time you'll pay attention instead of daydreaming about whatever weirdos like you think about. What is it anyway? Planning your next school shooting?" The casual cruelty of the comment hit her like a physical blow, and she felt her hands clench involuntarily as she continued gathering her belongings. The hallway continued its flow around them, students either too busy with their own concerns or too cowardly to intervene in what was becoming a familiar scene. This had become routine over the past week. Small humiliations, carefully timed and orchestrated, designed to chip away at her confidence and remind her that she was an outsider, unwelcome and unwanted. Delaney had faced bullies before in other schools. It seemed to be an inevitable part of the military brat experience, always being the new kid, always being the easy target. But something about Colton's crew felt different, more sophisticated in their cruelty. They weren't just mean, they were calculating, strategic in their approach. They chose their moments when teachers weren't around and witnesses were either complicit or indifferent. They'd studied her, learned her schedule, identified her vulnerabilities, and now they were systematically exploiting them. "Leave her alone." The voice came from behind the trio, calm but carrying an undertone of steel that made all three bullies pause in their casual torment. Delaney looked up from her position on the floor to see Asher Montenegro approaching, his dark hair slightly tousled as if he'd been running his fingers through it, and his brown eyes focused intently on Colton with an expression of quiet determination. He wasn't particularly tall or muscular, maybe 5'9" and lean rather than bulky. But something about his presence made the bullies hesitate. There was a confidence in his movements, a sense of someone who wouldn't back down easily despite the obvious physical disadvantage. His clothes were simple but well-maintained, dark jeans, a navy blue sweater that brought out his eyes, and worn but clean sneakers that suggested practicality over fashion. "Oh, look, the freak's got a boyfriend," Braden laughed, though Delaney noticed he took a small step back as he spoke, creating more distance between himself and Asher. "What are you going to do about it, Montenegro? Write us a strongly worded poem for your little newspaper. Maybe interview us about our feelings." The mockery in his voice was thick, but there was an underlying nervousness that suggested Asher's intervention wasn't entirely unexpected. Clearly, this wasn't the first time their paths had crossed, and the bullies weren't entirely comfortable with his presence. Asher moved past the three larger boys with deliberate calm, ignoring their attempts at intimidation as he knelt beside Delaney. His touch was gentle but confident as he helped gather her scattered papers, treating each item with the kind of care that suggested he understood how precious these small possessions were to someone who'd moved as often as she had. "I'm going to suggest you find something better to do with your time," he replied evenly, not looking up from the task of organizing her materials. "Picking on someone half your size isn't exactly impressive. In fact, it's pretty pathetic." The directness of his statement hung in the air like a challenge, and Delaney saw Colton's jaw tighten with anger. The quarterback wasn't used to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone he could easily overpower physically, but something about Asher's calm demeanor seemed to deflate his aggression slightly, as if the lack of fear was throwing off his usual script. "You know what your problem is, Montenegro?" Colton said, his voice dropping to a more dangerous register. "You think you're better than everyone else. You think your little writing hobby makes you some kind of intellectual superior, but this is high school, not some fancy college campus where being a nerd gets you respect." "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Asher replied, helping Delaney to her feet with a steadying hand on her elbow. "I just think there are better ways to spend your time than making someone else's life miserable. You're a talented athlete, Colton. You could be leading by example instead of leading by intimidation." The warning bell chose that moment to ring, its shrill electronic tone cutting through the tension like a knife. Students began moving more quickly toward their classrooms, and the crowd that had been casually observing the confrontation started to disperse. Colton shot both Delaney and Asher a look that promised future trouble, his blue eyes cold and calculating. "This isn't over," he muttered, loud enough for them to hear, but quiet enough to avoid attracting teacher attention. "Not even close." As the bullies disappeared into the crowd, moving with the easy confidence of those who knew they owned this space, Asher turned to Delaney with an expression of genuine concern. His brown eyes searched her face for signs of injury or distress, and she found herself struck by the kindness she saw there. It had been so long since someone had looked at her with anything other than indifference or malice. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but serious. "Those guys are absolute trash, and they're getting worse. Someone needs to put them in their place before they seriously hurt someone." "I'm fine," she said quietly, though her hands were still shaking slightly from the combination of adrenaline and suppressed anger. The encounter had triggered all her training instincts, and it had taken considerable self-control to remain passive while they humiliated her. "Thanks for stepping in, but you didn't have to. I don't want you getting in trouble because of me. I'm not worth the hassle." "Everyone deserves to feel safe at school," Asher replied firmly, adjusting his backpack strap as they began walking toward their next class. "And you're definitely worth the hassle. I'm Asher, by the way. I sit behind you in Mrs. Chen's English class, though I don't think we've been properly introduced." "Delaney." She managed a small smile, the first genuine one she'd felt in weeks. There was something about his straightforward manner, his lack of ulterior motives, that made her feel almost normal for the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls. "And I know who you are. You write for the school newspaper, right? I've read some of your articles. They're really good." They walked together toward their next class, and for a brief, shining moment, Delaney allowed herself to hope that maybe this school could be different from all the others. Maybe she could actually make a friend here, someone who saw her as more than just a target for their entertainment. Asher made her laugh with his dry observations about their teachers, his gentle mockery of the school's more ridiculous policies, and his surprisingly insightful comments about their classmates. She found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced since arriving in Cedar Falls, her shoulders dropping from their defensive hunch as she walked beside someone who seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. That hope, fragile as spun glass, proved to be devastatingly short-lived. The next day brought a new level of calculated torment that made the previous encounters seem almost benign by comparison. During lunch, as Delaney sat alone at a corner table in the cafeteria, reading her worn copy of The Outsiders, a book that felt increasingly relevant to her current situation, she became aware of familiar voices approaching. The cafeteria was a vast space filled with the usual chaos of teenage social dynamics, round tables scattered across the linoleum floor like islands of different social groups. The popular kids commanded the center tables, their laughter loud and confident, while the various subgroups, theater kids, band geeks, academic overachievers, and social outcasts, occupied their designated territories with the precision of a military formation. She'd chosen her table specifically for its isolation, tucked into a corner where she could eat in peace while observing the complex social ecosystem around her. The food wasn't particularly appetizing. Cafeteria pizza that tasted like cardboard topped with rubber cheese, wilted salad that had seen better days, and milk that came from cartons with dates she didn't trust. But it was fuel, and she'd learned long ago not to be picky about such things. Well, look what we have here." Jackson's voice carried clearly over the general din of conversation, and Delaney felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. The freak is eating lunch all by herself. How pathetic is that? She didn't look up from her book, hoping that ignoring them would make them lose interest and move on to easier prey. But she could sense them approaching, could feel the shift in the atmosphere around her table as other students noticed the impending confrontation and either moved away to avoid becoming collateral damage or stayed to watch the show. "I think she's reading," Braden added with mock amazement. "Look at that, guys. The weird girl knows how to read. Maybe we should applaud." Colton's presence loomed over her table like a dark cloud, and she could feel his shadow falling across her book. "You know what I think," he said conversationally, as if they were old friends catching up. "I think it's rude to read when people are trying to talk to you. Where are your manners, freak?" Delaney closed her book carefully, marking her place with a worn piece of paper, and looked up at the three boys surrounding her table. Colton held a full carton of chocolate milk in his hand, condensation beading on its waxy surface, and something about the way he was holding it made alarm bells ring in her head. "I wasn't aware you wanted to have a conversation," she said quietly, proud that her voice remained steady despite the anxiety clawing at her chest. "What did you want to talk about?" "Oh, just getting to know our newest classmate," Colton replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're very friendly here at Riverside High. We like to make sure everyone feels welcome." The cafeteria around them had grown noticeably quieter, conversations dying as students sensed the tension building at the corner table. Delaney was acutely aware of dozens of eyes watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Some faces showed concern, others curiosity, and more than a few displayed the kind of cruel anticipation that came from watching someone else's misfortune. "That's very kind of you," Delaney replied carefully, "but I'm fine. I don't need any special attention." "But that's where you're wrong," Jackson interjected, leaning closer to her table with a predatory grin. "Everyone needs friends. Everyone needs to learn how things work around here. And right now, you're not fitting in very well." "Maybe we can help with that," Braden added, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Give you some pointers on how to be more social, how to make friends. First lesson, Don't sit alone reading depressing books. It makes people think you're weird. Colton nodded sagely, as if he were dispensing profound wisdom. Exactly. Second lesson, when people try to be nice to you, you should be grateful. You should show appreciation. He paused, lifting the chocolate milk carton slightly. But I'm starting to think you're just ungrateful. Rude, even. I'm not trying to be rude, Delaney said, though she could feel her training instincts beginning to activate. Her muscles were tensing, her mind automatically cataloging potential threats and escape routes. The exits were across the cafeteria, blocked by tables and students. The serving line was to her left, but that would trap her in a corner. Her best option was probably to go over the table if things escalated, but that would require abandoning her belongings. See, that's exactly what I'm talking about, Colton said, shaking his head in mock disappointment. You say you're not trying to be rude, but then you sit here ignoring people, acting like you're too good for us simple Iowa kids, like you're so much more sophisticated because you've lived in other places. That's not, Delaney began, but Colton cut her off with a gesture. No, I get it. You're worldly, you're cultured. You probably think we're all just a bunch of hicks who don't know anything about the real world. His voice was getting louder, drawing more attention from nearby tables. Well, let me tell you something about the real world, freak. In the real world, people who act stuck up and antisocial get taught lessons. That's when it happened. With a theatrical gasp of surprise, Jackson accidentally bumped into Colton's arm, sending the chocolate milk carton flying directly toward Delaney's table. The sticky, brown liquid cascaded across the surface like a sweet-smelling waterfall, soaking her sandwich, her book, her homework, and everything else within reach. The milk splashed onto her jeans and sweater, the cold liquid seeping through the fabric to her skin. The entire cafeteria erupted in laughter, the sound hitting Delaney like a physical blow. Students pointed and whispered, some pulling out their phones to capture her humiliation for social media posterity. The chocolate milk continued to drip from the table onto the floor, creating a puddle that reflected the fluorescent lights overhead. "Oops," Jackson said with exaggerated concern, pressing his hand to his chest in mock horror. "I'm so sorry. I'm such a klutz. Guess you'll have to go hungry today, Butterfingers. Maybe next time you'll be more careful where you sit." Delaney stared at the destruction of her lunch, her homework, and her book, the same copy of The Outsiders that had been with her through 3 different schools and countless lonely lunches. The pages were now soggy with chocolate milk, the spine warped and the cover stained beyond repair. It felt like losing an old friend. Her training was screaming at her to react, to show these privileged bullies what happened when you pushed someone who knew how to fight back. Every instinct honed by years of discipline and practice was telling her to stand up, to demonstrate that actions had consequences, to make them understand that she wasn't helpless prey. But her father's voice echoed in her mind, clear and stern, as it had been during countless training sessions. Your skills are for protection, not for proving points. Violence should always be the last resort, Dell. Walk away unless you have no choice. The moment you use your training for anything other than genuine self-defense, you become no better than the bullies themselves. So she gathered her ruined belongings with as much dignity as she could muster, her movements careful and controlled, despite the rage building in her chest. Paper towels from the nearby dispenser did little to salvage her soaked homework or repair her destroyed book. The laughter followed her as she walked toward the exit, her shoes squelching slightly from the milk that had dripped onto her feet. "See you around, freak," Colton called after her, his voice carrying easily across the now quieter cafeteria. "Try to be more careful next time." Delaney pushed through the cafeteria doors and found herself in the empty hallway, her hands shaking with suppressed emotion. She leaned against the cool brick wall and closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing the way her father had taught her. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 4. The anger was a living thing inside her chest, hot and demanding, but she forced it down through sheer willpower. She spent the rest of lunch period in the bathroom, trying to clean chocolate milk off her clothes and attempting to salvage what she could of her homework. The ruined book went into the trash, and she tried not to think of it as an omen for how the rest of her time at Riverside High would go. The harassment didn't stop there. In fact, it seemed to feed on itself, growing stronger and more creative with each passing day. They'd learned that she wouldn't fight back, that she would endure their torments with quiet dignity, and that knowledge made them bolder. They would wait by her locker between classes, forming a human wall that forced her to squeeze past them while they made comments about her appearance, her clothes, her apparent lack of friends. Colton would examine her critically, as if she were livestock he was considering purchasing. "You know, if you did something with your hair, you might actually be passable," he would say, reaching out as if to touch her auburn waves before pulling back with a laugh. "But then again, maybe it's better this way. At least people know what they're dealing with." During gym class, which took place in a converted warehouse of a gymnasium that smelled perpetually of sweat and industrial disinfectant, Braden had appointed himself as her personal tormentor. When they played volleyball, he would accidentally spike balls directly at her head with enough force to knock her glasses off. When they ran laps around the track, he would pace himself to run just behind her, making crude comments about her body just loud enough for her to hear, but too quiet for the coaches to notice. The psychological warfare was methodical and relentless, designed to wear down her resistance through 1,000 small cuts rather than one dramatic confrontation. They spread rumors about her being antisocial, stuck up, and mentally unstable. They would strike up conversations with her in hallways, then laugh and walk away when she tried to respond, making her look foolish to anyone watching. They would accidentally knock books out of her hands, step on her feet, or block her path to the bathroom until she was almost late for class. What made it worse was the complicity of their peers. Most students simply looked the other way, unwilling to risk becoming targets themselves by interfering. Some actively encouraged the bullying, laughing at the cruel jokes and sharing the humiliating photos that circulated on social media. A few seemed genuinely disturbed by what they witnessed, but none were brave enough to speak up in any meaningful way. Asher tried to help when he could, but the bullies were careful to avoid him or strike when he wasn't around. His presence had become a bright spot in Delaney's increasingly dark days, a reminder that not everyone in Cedar Falls was cruel or indifferent. They'd started eating lunch together when possible, sharing a table in the library where the bullies were less likely to follow. Their conversations about books, movies, and their shared love of photography provided a refuge from the constant stress of navigating the hostile environment that school had become. "They're getting worse," Asher observed one afternoon as they sat in the library, sharing a bag of pretzels he'd brought from home. The space around them was quiet and warm, filled with the comforting smell of old books and the soft sound of pages turning. "Colton's crew, I mean. They're not usually this focused on one person for this long." "Lucky me," Delaney replied with bitter humor, absently rubbing her arm where Braden had accidentally slammed into her during the change between classes. "I must be special." "You are special," Asher said seriously, causing her to look up from her homework in surprise. "But not in the way they're trying to make you feel. You're smart, you're kind, you're stronger than they could possibly imagine. They target you because they're threatened by those qualities." "Threatened by me?" Delaney laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm 5 feet tall and weigh maybe 100 pounds soaking wet. I'm about as threatening as a house cat." "Physical size isn't the only kind of strength," Asher replied, his brown eyes serious and intent. "You've got something they don't: integrity, resilience, the ability to maintain your dignity even when they're doing everything they can to strip it away. That scares them more than you know." Delaney felt a warm flush of gratitude spread through her chest, followed immediately by a sharp pang of fear. Asher was becoming important to her, more important than was probably wise given their circumstances. She'd learned through painful experience that caring about people only made them into weapons that others could use against her. "You should be careful," she said quietly, gathering her things as the final bell of the day approached. "Being seen with me too much is going to make you a target too. They already don't like you for defending me." "Let me worry about that," Asher replied, shouldering his backpack with easy confidence. "I've been dealing with guys like Colton since middle school. They're not as scary as they think they are." But Delaney could see the concern in his eyes, the way he glanced around corners before stepping into hallways, the tension in his shoulders when the trio of bullies was nearby. He was already becoming a target, and it was her fault. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone, heavy and uncomfortable, and growing larger with each passing day. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in late September, when the Iowa air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the leaves on the oak trees surrounding the school had begun their slow transformation from green to gold. The day had started normally enough, or at least normally by the new standards that had been established over the past month. A few casual insults in the hallway, some accidental collisions, the usual whispered comments that followed her from class to class like a poisonous shadow. But there was something different in the air that afternoon, a tension that made Delaney's trained instincts hum with unease. Colton and his crew had been watching her more intently than usual, their eyes following her movements with a predatory focus that suggested they were planning something more elaborate than their usual casual cruelties. She was walking toward the parking lot, where the school buses lined up like yellow dominoes, waiting to transport students home to the comfort and safety of their families, when she heard familiar voices near the gymnasium entrance. The sound made her stomach drop with dread, because she recognized not just the bullies' voices, but Asher's as well, strained and defensive in a way that made alarm bells ring in her head. The gymnasium was located at the back of the school, separated from the main building by a covered walkway and surrounded by parking areas and loading docks. It was isolated enough that teacher supervision was minimal, especially at the end of the day when most staff were eager to head home themselves. The perfect location for a confrontation that no adult would witness or interrupt. "I told you to back off," Asher was saying, his usual calm cracking slightly around the edges. Delaney could hear the effort it was taking for him to keep his voice level, the way someone sounds when they're trying to de-escalate a situation they know is spinning out of control. "Or what?" Colton's laugh was harsh and mocking, carrying clearly in the crisp autumn air. "You'll write about us in your little newspaper, interview our parents about what disappointing sons they've raised. Face it, Montenegro, you're nothing but a wannabe journalist who thinks he's better than everyone else because he can string a few sentences together." Delaney crept closer to the corner of the building, her heart beginning to race with a combination of fear and anger. Through the gap between the gymnasium and the main building, she could see Asher backed against the brick wall, Colton looming over him, while Jackson and Braden flanked him on either side like wolves cornering their prey. The sight made her training instincts roar to life, every nerve ending suddenly hypersensitive to potential threats and opportunities for action. "You know what your problem is," Colton continued, his voice dropping to a more dangerous register that carried undertones of real menace. "You think you can play hero for that weird girl, like you're in some kind of movie where the underdog gets the girl and everyone learns a valuable lesson about acceptance. But this is real life, Montenegro, and real life has consequences for people who don't know their place." "She's not weird," Asher replied firmly, though Delaney could see his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white with tension. "She's just trying to get through school like everyone else. Maybe if you actually tried talking to people instead of terrorizing them, you'd realize that most of them are pretty decent human beings with their own stories and struggles." The slap echoed off the gymnasium walls like a gunshot, the sharp crack of palm against flesh making Delaney flinch instinctively. Colton's hand had moved so fast it was just a blur, connecting with Asher's cheek with enough force to snap his head to the side and leave an immediate red mark on his pale skin. "Don't lecture me, you pretentious little punk," Colton snarled, his facade of casual cruelty dropping away to reveal the genuine anger underneath. "Maybe it's time someone taught you about respect, about what happens to people who stick their nose where it doesn't belong." Jackson and Braden moved closer, forming a tighter circle around Asher as he pressed his back against the brick wall and touched his stinging cheek with tentative fingers. There was nowhere for him to run, no escape route that wouldn't require going through at least one of his tormentors. The situation was escalating beyond verbal intimidation into something much more dangerous. That's when Delaney stepped around the corner, her movement deliberate and controlled, despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice carrying further than she'd intended in the quiet afternoon air. All four boys turned to look at her, and she saw the predatory gleam that immediately lit up Colton's blue eyes. This was what he'd been waiting for, the opportunity to confront her directly, away from the protective oversight of teachers and administrators. His cruel smile spread across his handsome features like oil on water, dark and slick and poisonous. "Well, well, well," he said, releasing Asher and turning his full attention to her with the focus of a hunter who had just spotted wounded prey. "Look who decided to join the party. Come to rescue your boyfriend, freak." "He's not my boyfriend," Delaney said quietly, though she felt heat rising in her cheeks at the implication. The denial felt important somehow, as if admitting to caring about Asher would give them additional ammunition to use against both of them. "Just leave him alone. Your problem is with me, not him." Colton released Asher completely and turned his full attention to her, beginning to walk toward her with slow, deliberate steps that reminded her of a predator stalking wounded prey. Each footfall seemed to echo in the quiet space between the buildings, the sound somehow more menacing than it should have been. "You're right about that," he said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made her skin crawl. "You know what? I think it's time we had a proper conversation about your attitude problem, about the way you've been disrespecting people who've tried to be nice to you." Jackson and Braden spread out to flank her, cutting off potential escape routes with the practiced ease of predators who had done this before. The movement was coordinated, suggesting they'd planned this confrontation in advance, thought through the logistics of cornering her in this isolated location where no one would intervene on her behalf. Delaney's training kicked in automatically, her mind shifting into the analytical mode her father had drilled into her through countless hours of practice. She assessed distances, angles, potential weapons, and exit strategies with the cold efficiency of a computer processing data. The closest exit was back the way she'd come, but that would mean abandoning Asher to whatever they had planned for him. The loading dock offered potential cover, but was too far away to reach before they could intercept her. Her best option was probably to try to de-escalate the situation verbally while positioning herself for defensive action if necessary. But still, her father's voice held her back from taking any aggressive action. These were just teenagers being cruel, not genuine threats to her safety. She could endure this, just as she'd endured everything else they'd subjected her to over the past month. Violence would only make things worse, would mark her as dangerous and unpredictable in a way that would follow her for the rest of her time at Riverside High. "Please," Asher called out, starting to move toward them despite the obvious danger to himself. "Just leave her alone. This is stupid. You're all going to end up in serious trouble if this goes any further." "Stay back," Braden warned, turning to shove Asher hard enough to send him stumbling backward against the brick wall. "This doesn't concern you anymore. You've already done enough damage by encouraging her to think she's too good for us normal people." Colton continued his approach, now close enough that Delaney could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the faint scent of cigarettes and something else, maybe alcohol. His pupils were slightly dilated, and there was a reckless gleam in his eyes that suggested this confrontation was about more than just teenage bullying. He was angry about something else, something that had nothing to do with her, and she was simply a convenient target for his rage. "You think you're so special, don't you?" he continued, now only a few feet away from her. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, making his face appear harsh and angular. "Walking around here like you're better than everyone, like you're too good to even talk to people who've lived here their whole lives. Well, maybe it's time someone knocked you down a few pegs." "I've never said I was better than anyone," Delaney replied, keeping her voice as calm and steady as possible, while every instinct screamed at her to prepare for combat. "I'm just trying to get through my senior year and graduate. I don't want any trouble." "But trouble wants you," Jackson said with a laugh that held no humor. "Trouble has been looking for you since the day you walked into our school with your stuck-up attitude and your weird clothes and your antisocial behavior." "You know what I think?" Colton said, reaching out suddenly to grab a handful of Delaney's long auburn hair, his grip tight enough to make her scalp burn with immediate pain. "I think you need to learn some manners, maybe some respect for the people who actually matter at this school." The pain shot through her scalp like electricity, sharp and immediate and infuriating. But it wasn't the physical discomfort that finally broke something inside Delaney. It was the sound of Ash's sharp intake of breath, the mixture of pain and helplessness in his voice as he said her name. It was the realization that these bullies would never stop, that they would keep escalating their attacks until someone got seriously hurt, that their cruelty would spread to anyone who tried to help her. "Let go of me," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of warning that would have been recognizable to anyone who knew her father or had witnessed him in action. Colton yanked harder, forcing her head back at an uncomfortable angle that made her neck muscles strain with the effort of maintaining balance. His grip twisted in her hair, and she could feel individual strands pulling tight against her scalp. "Or what? What are you going to do about it, little girl? Cry? Run to your daddy and tell him the mean kids are picking on you?" That's when Delaney made her choice. Her training took over with fluid precision that would have made her father proud. The countless hours of practice in military gymnasiums around the world, the muscle memory drilled into her through repetition and discipline, the instincts honed by years of preparation for exactly this kind of situation. All of it came together in a moment of perfect clarity. She reached up with both hands, grasping Colton's wrist with her left while using her right to support his elbow. The grip was exactly as her Krav Maga instructor had taught her, firm but not desperate, positioned to provide maximum leverage while maintaining her own balance. In one swift motion, she pivoted her entire body, using her hips and core strength to generate the force needed to overcome his size advantage. The arm manipulation was textbook perfect, a classic technique designed to hyperextend the elbow joint beyond its natural range of motion. She applied pressure gradually at first, giving him the opportunity to release her hair and step back. But when he tightened his grip instead of letting go, she completed the movement with the kind of controlled violence that separated trained fighters from playground bullies. The crack was audible across the parking lot, a sharp sound like a tree branch snapping under too much weight. It was followed immediately by Colton's scream, a sound of pure anguish that shattered the afternoon air and sent birds fleeing from the nearby trees. He released her hair instantly, dropping to his knees on the concrete and cradling his arm against his chest as waves of pain rolled through his system. "You broke it," he gasped, his face pale with shock and agony, beads of sweat already forming on his forehead, despite the cool autumn air. "You actually broke my arm. What kind of psycho are you?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Colton's labored breathing and the distant sound of traffic on the road beyond the school grounds. Jackson and Braden stood frozen like statues, their mouths hanging open as they stared at their leader writhing on the concrete. The transformation was complete and immediate. The confident predators had become confused children, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. Students who had been walking to their buses stopped and turned, drawn by the sound of Colton's scream. A crowd began to form at the edges of the parking lot, teenagers pulling out their phones to record the aftermath of what would undoubtedly become the most talked-about incident in Riverside High's recent history. Delaney stepped back from the scene, her breathing controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins like liquid fire. Her training had taken over so completely that she felt almost detached from what had just happened, as if she were watching events unfold from a distance rather than being the primary actor in this drama. "I told you to let go," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. There was no anger in her tone, no satisfaction or cruelty, just a statement of fact delivered with the kind of calm that comes from someone who has done exactly what they were trained to do. "You psycho." Jackson finally found his voice, but he made no move toward her. His eyes kept darting between Delaney and his writhing friend, as if he couldn't decide which one posed the greater threat. "You can't just attack people like that. That's assault." "Attack?" Delaney's laugh was cold and humorless, the sound carrying undertones of a deeper anger that had been building for weeks. "He grabbed me first. He twisted my hair hard enough to hurt me, and he refused to let go when I asked him to. I defended myself. There's a difference." Braden was already fumbling with his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely operate the touchscreen. Whether he was calling for medical help or trying to document the scene for later use as evidence, Delaney couldn't tell and didn't particularly care. The damage was done, the line had been crossed, and there would be no going back to the way things were. The mighty trio that had terrorized her for weeks, that had made her life a daily exercise in enduring humiliation and psychological torture, had been reduced to a whimpering quarterback and 2 terrified followers in the span of 5 seconds. The shift in power dynamics was so complete and sudden that it felt almost surreal. Asher appeared at her side, his eyes wide with amazement and concern. His cheek still bore the red mark from Colton's slap, but his focus was entirely on her, searching her face for signs of injury or distress. "Delaney, are you okay? Where did you learn to do that?" "I'm fine," she said, though her heart was still racing from the confrontation. She looked down at Colton, who was making wounded animal sounds as he rocked back and forth on the concrete. Despite everything he'd put her through, she felt a pang of something that might have been guilt. "It's just a simple break. He'll live." "Just a simple break?" Colton managed to gasp out between waves of pain, his voice high and strained. "You're completely insane. No normal person just breaks someone's arm because they grabbed their hair." "No," Delaney replied, kneeling down so she was at his eye level, her voice calm and measured despite the storm of emotions churning in her chest. "Normal people don't grab other people's hair and refuse to let go when asked. Normal people don't spend weeks terrorizing someone just because they're new and different. Normal people don't corner others in isolated areas and threaten them." She gestured toward Asher, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of fascination and concern. "He tried to help me, so you decided to hurt him too. That was your mistake. I can tolerate a lot of things, but I won't stand by and watch you hurt someone who was just trying to do the right thing." The crowd around them was growing larger, with several students recording the scene on their phones. Delaney could hear the excited whispers spreading through the group like wildfire, stories already being embellished and transformed as they passed from person to person. The quiet new girl had just taken down the school's star quarterback with her bare hands, and the implications of that were still sinking in for everyone involved. "I could have done worse," she continued, her voice carrying to the edge of the crowd. "Much worse. But I'm not like you. I don't hurt people just because I can. What you needed wasn't more pain. You needed to understand that your actions have consequences." Principal Harrison's voice cut through the crowd as he pushed his way to the center of the circle, his face flushed from running across the parking lot. "What's going on here? Someone called about a fight." His eyes took in the scene quickly. Colton on the ground cradling his arm, Delaney standing calmly nearby, and the circle of students recording everything on their phones. "She attacked me." Colton immediately pointed at Delaney with his good arm, his voice still strained with pain, but gaining strength from righteous indignation. "She just went crazy and broke my arm for no reason. I need an ambulance." "That's not what happened," Asher said firmly, stepping forward to face the principal. Colton and his friends cornered her by the gym. He grabbed her hair and was threatening her. She was defending herself. "He's lying," Braden protested, but his voice lacked conviction. The evidence was pretty clear. Colton was the one on the ground injured, while Delaney showed no signs of having been in a fight. Colton was just talking to her and she snapped. Principal Harrison looked around the crowd, his experienced eyes taking in the dynamics of the situation. "I need witnesses. What did everyone see? And put those phones away. This isn't entertainment." To Delaney's surprise, several students spoke up in her defense. The first was Madison Cooper, a senior she'd never spoken to, but who had apparently been watching the bullying campaign with growing disgust. "Colton and his friends have been harassing her for weeks," she said clearly, her voice carrying easily across the parking lot. "I saw him grab her hair and pull it really hard. She asked him to let go, and when he wouldn't, she defended herself." "Yeah," added Tyler Morrison, a sophomore whose locker was near Delaney's. "They've been messing with her since she got here, making her life miserable just because they could. Today, they finally went too far." More voices joined in, painting a clear picture of systematic bullying that had culminated in this moment of violence. Delaney realized that more people had been watching than she'd thought. They'd just been too afraid or apathetic to intervene before. Now, with the dynamic suddenly shifted and the bullies' power broken, they felt safe enough to speak the truth. The stories that emerged painted a damning picture of coordinated harassment. Students described the daily humiliations, the deliberate accidents, the psychological warfare that had been designed to break down Delaney's resistance. They talked about seeing her eating lunch alone, walking through hallways with her head down, trying to make herself invisible to avoid attracting attention. "She never fought back before," said Jamie Chen, a quiet girl from Delaney's chemistry class. "They kept pushing and pushing, trying to get a reaction, but she just took it, like she was hoping they'd get bored and leave her alone." "They were getting worse," added Marcus Williams, a member of the school newspaper staff who had witnessed several of the incidents. "More aggressive, more personal. It was like they were building up to something bigger." The paramedics arrived within minutes, their red and white ambulance cutting through the crowd of students like a ship through water. They carefully assessed Colton's injury, immobilizing his arm with professional efficiency before loading him onto a stretcher. As they wheeled him away, he shot Delaney a look that mixed pain with something that might have been grudging respect. "This isn't over," he muttered through gritted teeth, though the words lacked his usual venom and confidence. "Yeah, it is," Delaney replied quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for him to hear. "For all of us." Principal Harrison spent the next hour gathering detailed statements from witnesses, his expression growing more serious as the full scope of the bullying campaign became clear. When he finally addressed Delaney directly, his tone was measured but sympathetic. "Miss Reese, while I understand you were defending yourself, we're going to need to discuss this situation in detail. This kind of violence, even in self-defense, has serious consequences under school policy. However, given the circumstances and the witness statements, I think we can work something out that's fair to everyone involved." "I understand," Delaney nodded, feeling emotionally drained despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "But I want to be clear about something. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted them to stop. I asked him to let go, and when he wouldn't, I did what I had to do to protect myself." The principal studied her for a long moment, then glanced at Asher and the other witnesses who had remained behind. "We'll sort this out properly on Monday. For now, I think everyone should head home and let today's event settle. Miss Reese, I'll need you and your parents in my office first thing Monday morning." As the crowd began to disperse and the buses finally started their routes, Asher walked with Delaney toward the student parking lot where her father would be picking her up. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the pavement and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "So," he said after a few moments of contemplative silence, "martial arts?" "Something like that," she replied, still feeling the effects of the adrenaline crash that was beginning to set in. Her hands were starting to shake slightly, and she felt emotionally raw in a way that made everything seem too bright and too loud. "My dad's military. He made sure I could take care of myself." "Remind me never to get on your bad side," Asher said with a small smile, though his expression remained serious. "Though I have to ask, why didn't you do something sooner? You could have ended this weeks ago." Delaney was quiet for a moment, watching the last few buses pull away from the school with their cargo of students who were undoubtedly gossiping about what they'd just witnessed. The story would spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire, growing and changing with each telling until it bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. "Because once you show people what you're capable of, everything changes," she said finally. "They either fear you or they challenge you, and neither option leads to a normal life. I've been the dangerous girl before at other schools, and it's not any better than being the victim. Maybe worse in some ways. And you want a normal life?" "I wanted to try," she admitted, thinking about all the small hopes she'd harbored when they'd first arrived in Cedar Falls. The possibility of making real friends, of being seen as something other than a weapon or a target, of experiencing the kind of typical teenage life she'd read about in books, but never actually lived. "But I guess that's not really an option anymore." Asher stopped walking and turned to face her, his brown eyes serious and intent. "For what it's worth, I think what you did was brave. Not the fighting part, though that was pretty impressive, but the part where you stood up for yourself, and for me." Their eyes met, and Delaney felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with adrenaline or the aftermath of violence. It was something warmer and more hopeful, a feeling she'd almost forgotten was possible after weeks of daily humiliation and isolation. "You stood up for me first," she reminded him, her voice softer than it had been all afternoon. "Even when you knew it might get you hurt. That took real courage." "Yeah, well," Asher shrugged, his cheeks reddening slightly in the golden light of the setting sun. "That's what decent people do for each other, and despite what just happened, I think you're one of the most decent people I've ever met." The sound of a car horn interrupted their conversation, and Delaney looked up to see her father's familiar green pickup truck pulling into the parking lot. Sergeant Major Daniel Reese was the imposing figure even in civilian clothes, his posture military straight and his eyes constantly scanning for potential threats. When he saw Delaney standing next to a boy he didn't recognize, his expression shifted into protective mode. "That's my dad," Delaney said, suddenly nervous about how this introduction would go. "He's intense." "I can see that," Asher replied, watching as the truck approached with the kind of caution usually reserved for observing wild predators. "Should I be worried?" "Probably," Delaney admitted with a small smile. "But he'll like you once he gets to know you. He respects people who stand up for what's right." As her father climbed out of the truck, Delaney realized that her life at Riverside High was about to change completely. The quiet anonymity she'd tried to maintain was gone forever, replaced by a reputation that would follow her for the rest of her senior year. But looking at Asher's concerned face and thinking about the students who had finally found the courage to speak up against bullying, she thought that maybe the change wouldn't be entirely unwelcome. Epilogue. New dynamics. The following Monday brought a completely different atmosphere to Riverside High School, as if the entire social ecosystem had been fundamentally altered by 5 seconds of decisive action. Word of the confrontation had spread over the weekend with the speed and efficiency of wildfire, evolving into legend with each retelling. By the time Delaney arrived at school that morning, walking through the front doors with her father beside her for their meeting with Principal Harrison, she discovered that her quiet anonymity had been permanently and irrevocably shattered. Students she'd never spoken to nodded respectfully as she passed in the hallways, their expressions ranging from curiosity to admiration to carefully concealed fear. Some stepped aside to give her more space, as if proximity to her might be dangerous. Others leaned in closer, hoping to catch a glimpse of the girl who had single-handedly taken down the school's most feared bully. The usual crowd that gathered around Colton's locker every morning was notably absent. He was still at home recovering from his broken arm and the equally significant damage to his reputation. According to the rumors already circulating, he would be returning on Wednesday with his arm in a cast and a considerably altered perspective on his place in the school's social hierarchy. Jackson and Braden kept their distance, shooting her wary glances from across hallways, but making no attempt to approach or continue their campaign of harassment. Without Colton's leadership and confidence, they seemed diminished, less sure of themselves and their right to torment others. The power structure that had seemed so permanent and unchangeable had been revealed to be as fragile as spun glass. During lunch, Delaney was surprised to find herself surrounded by classmates who wanted to hear her side of the story. She deflected most of their questions, uncomfortable with the attention and unsure how to navigate her new status as a figure of fascination. But she noticed something important happening around her. The fear that had permeated the cafeteria for weeks was gone. Other students who had been targets of various bullies were sitting up straighter, speaking more confidently, looking around with something that resembled hope rather than resignation. "You started something," Asher observed as they walked to their next class together, navigating hallways that felt fundamentally different than they had just days before. "People are talking about standing up for themselves instead of just enduring whatever gets thrown at them." "That wasn't my intention," Delaney replied, though she couldn't deny the satisfaction she felt seeing other students empowered by her example. "I just wanted them to leave us alone. I never meant to become some kind of symbol or inspiration." "Sometimes the most important changes happen when people weren't trying to change anything," Asher said thoughtfully. "They just get pushed far enough that they have to push back, and everyone else realizes that pushing back is actually possible." The real test of how much things had changed came Thursday afternoon when Colton returned to school, his arm encased in a bright blue cast that seemed to announce his defeat to the entire student body. The usual swagger was gone, replaced by something more cautious and subdued. His entourage had similarly diminished. Jackson and Braden still followed him, but at a greater distance and with less enthusiasm than before. Delaney was at her locker when she sensed someone approaching, the familiar prickle of awareness that came from being watched. She turned to find Colton standing a careful distance away, his usual confident posture replaced by something that suggested uncertainty and perhaps even vulnerability. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard by the students who continued to flow past them in the endless dance of changing classes. Delaney studied his face for signs of deception or anger, searching for any indication that this was another trap or elaborate setup for humiliation. But all she found was exhaustion and something that might have been genuine regret, emotions that seemed as foreign on his features as they were unexpected. "Okay," she said simply, closing her locker and following him to an empty classroom where they could have privacy. Once the door was closed behind them, Colton seemed to deflate slightly, his imposing presence diminished by the weight of whatever he'd come to say. He slumped into one of the plastic desk chairs, suddenly looking much younger than his imposing presence usually suggested. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble, the words coming out in a rush as if he'd been practicing them. "What I did was wrong. What we did was wrong. All of it. The harassment, the humiliation, cornering you like that. It was unacceptable and I'm sorry." "Why?" Delaney asked simply, taking a seat across from him. "Why did you target me specifically? What did I do to deserve that treatment?" Colton was quiet for a long moment, staring at his cast as if it held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it, stripped of its usual arrogance and bravado. "Because it was easy," he admitted, the honesty clearly difficult for him. "You were new, you were quiet, you didn't fight back. And honestly, because I was angry about other stuff and taking it out on someone who couldn't hurt me back seemed safer than dealing with my real problems." "What real problems?" Delaney asked, though she suspected she already knew part of the answer. Bullies, in her experience, were rarely happy people. They were usually fighting battles of their own and using cruelty as a way to feel powerful in situations where they otherwise felt helpless. He was quiet for another long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of his cast with nervous energy. "My parents are getting divorced," he said finally. "Have been fighting about it for months now, screaming matches every night, lawyers, threats about custody and money, and who gets to keep the house. My dad expects me to get a football scholarship because he never could, but my grades are garbage and scouts are already losing interest. My mom keeps telling me I'm the only good thing in her life, which is a hell of a lot of pressure for someone who can barely keep his own life together." Delaney felt an unexpected pang of sympathy, recognizing the pain beneath his words, despite everything he'd put her through. "That doesn't excuse what you did," she said gently but firmly. "No, it doesn't," Colton agreed, meeting her eyes for the first time since they'd sat down. "I know that now. I knew it then too, if I'm being honest. But it felt good to have control over something, anything, when everything else in my life was spinning out of control. You were convenient, and I convinced myself you deserved it because you were different." "Different how?" "Smart, self-contained. Like you didn't need anyone else's approval to know who you were." He laughed bitterly. "Everything I wished I could be, but was too scared to try. So instead of dealing with my own insecurities, I tried to tear you down to my level." Delaney considered his words carefully, weighing them against her memories of the past month's torment. "You could have hurt me a lot worse than you did, couldn't you?" she asked, echoing his question from Friday afternoon. "Yes," she admitted without hesitation. "Why didn't you?" The question hung in the air between them, and Delaney found herself thinking about all the times she could have ended their harassment campaign. All the moments when her training screamed at her to fight back and show them what real power looked like. "Because hurting people doesn't solve anything," she said finally. "It just creates more hurt, more anger, more people looking for someone weaker to take their pain out on. What you needed wasn't more pain. You needed to understand that your actions have consequences, that other people's feelings matter as much as your own." Colton nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I get it now, and I'm sorry, not just for grabbing you, but for all of it. The hallway stuff, the cafeteria, making your life miserable just because I could." He paused, then added, "I told Jackson and Braden to back off too. They won't bother you anymore, or anyone else, if I have anything to say about it." "What about other people?" Delaney asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind since Friday. "Are you going to find new targets now that I'm off limits?" "No," Colton said firmly, and something in his voice suggested he meant it. "I'm done with all that. I'm going to try to figure out how to deal with my actual problems instead of creating new ones for other people. Maybe talk to someone about what's going on at home, try to get my grades up, actually work on becoming the person I want to be, instead of the person my anger makes me." As they prepared to leave the classroom, Colton stopped at the door and turned back to face her. "For what it's worth, you're tougher than anyone I know, not because you can break arms, though that was pretty impressive, but because you stayed yourself even when we were trying to break you down. That takes a kind of strength I'm not sure I have." "You have it," Delaney said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "You just have to choose to use it for something better than hurting people." The rest of the semester passed with a peace that Delaney had never experienced in any school before. She found herself settling into a rhythm at Riverside High that felt almost normal. She had friends, she felt safe walking the hallways, and she was no longer constantly looking over her shoulder for the next humiliation or attack. Her relationship with Asher deepened as they spent more time together, studying in the library, sharing quiet conversations about their dreams and fears, and discovering the kind of connection that felt both exciting and comforting. He introduced her to other students who shared their interests, members of the newspaper staff, photography enthusiasts, kids who spent their free time reading instead of attending parties. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged to a community rather than just existing on its periphery. She even began to appreciate the respect her classmates showed her, though she was careful never to use her skills for anything other than protection. When a group of older students tried to intimidate a younger boy for his lunch money, a simple look from Delaney was enough to send them walking away. Word had spread about what happened to the last person who underestimated the quiet girl with the auburn hair, and most potential troublemakers decided their pride wasn't worth the risk. The change wasn't limited to her own experience. The entire social dynamic of the school seemed to shift as students realized they didn't have to accept mistreatment as inevitable. Reports of bullying incidents decreased dramatically, and several students who had previously been targets found the courage to seek help from teachers and administrators. The culture of fear and submission that had allowed the harassment to flourish was gradually replaced by something healthier and more supportive. Principal Harrison, who had initially been concerned about the precedent Delaney's actions might set, found himself dealing with fewer disciplinary problems than he'd seen in years. Students were more willing to report problems early rather than letting them escalate, and the tacit acceptance of bullying behavior was replaced by peer pressure to treat others with basic human decency. On the last day before winter break, Delaney was cleaning out her locker when she found a note that had been slipped through the vents. The paper was worn and creased, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times before being delivered. Inside was a simple message written in careful handwriting. "Thank you for showing us that we don't have to be victims, the students you inspired." She smiled, folding the note carefully and tucking it into her backpack alongside her other treasured possessions. Walking toward the exit where Asher was waiting for her, Delaney reflected on how much had changed since that day in September when she'd first walked through these doors, hoping for nothing more than anonymity and peace. She'd learned that sometimes standing up for yourself means more than just protecting your own dignity. It means showing others that they have the power to protect theirs too. That the quiet ones are often the ones with the most strength to give, and that real courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right, despite being afraid. The girl who had tried so hard to blend into the background had discovered that some battles are worth fighting, not for revenge or dominance, but for the simple right to exist without fear. And sometimes, the most important victories are the ones that make it possible for others to win their own battles. As she walked out into the cold December air with Asher beside her, Delaney felt something she'd never experienced before. The sense of belonging somewhere, of having made a real difference in a place that would always be part of her story. For the first time in her nomadic life, leaving would be hard. Not because she was running from something, but because she was leaving something meaningful behind. But she was also taking something with her. The knowledge that home isn't just a place you belong to, but a place where you choose to make a stand for what matters. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is show others that standing up is possible, that dignity is worth fighting for, and that even the quietest voice can change everything when it finally decides to speak.